Chapter 13 of the Boy Scouts in Russia by John Blaine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kangaroo. The Escape. "What's the matter with him, Schmidt?" asked the officer. Fred knew enough of German uniforms by this time to place him as a lieutenant of the lowest grade, and was thankful that he did not have an experienced man to deal with. "Deaf and dumb, I think, Herr Lieutenant," said the man. "I rode up behind him, calling to him and making a good deal of noise, but he did not even know I was coming until I was on top of him." "Well, he can't go this way," said the lieutenant. "How are we to make him understand that?" "If I dismounted and turned him about, he might perhaps understand," said the soldier. "Try it." Fred had hard work to conceal his amusement, but he managed it. The soldier solemnly turned him about and pushed him in the direction whence he had come. But Fred immediately turned around, walked a couple of paces as he had been going, and then stopped, smiling broadly. Then he turned around, shook his head violently, and turned back. "He is trying to tell us he wants to keep on the way he is going," said the lieutenant. The two Germans seemed to be puzzled, but then the officer got an idea. He produced paper and pencil and wrote hurriedly. "Who are you? Where are you going?" he wrote. Then he handed the paper to Fred. Fred hesitated for a moment. He understood German and could take it very well. But he was a little nervous about writing it, especially in the German script. He could write it, but he was not sure that he could write it so well that it would seem like the work of a German. However, he took the chance. "My name is Gebhardt," he wrote. "I come from Munich, and I am visiting my uncle and aunt here at Gumbinnen. My uncle sent me to Insterberg, and then I found I could not go back by train. Soldiers have made me turn around so many times that it has taken me all this time to get here. Why can I not go to Gumbinnen?" The officer took the paper, and when he had read it, he told the soldier. They seemed to find Fred's explanation plausible, and his writing had passed muster. "Here is a fine mess," said the lieutenant. "Poor boy! I feel sorry for one with such an affliction. And is he not between the devil and the deep blue sea? In Gumbinnen there will be Russian cavalry by tomorrow. And at Insterberg, I suppose, the first real battle will be fought." Fred caught his breath. He was getting what he wanted to know, certainly. If only he did not betray himself. If the officer would only go and tell him a little more. And he did go on, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "If his people have any sense, they will have cleared out of Gumbinnen before this. He knows someone at Insterberg, perhaps, but if it is the plan to let the Russians come so far without fighting and then strike while they are there, the population will have been ordered out. And they have been unloading troop trains at Insterberg, too, so that the Russians would not find out how many men we had here. Take him up behind you, Schmidt. We can't abandon him. Perhaps the hospital people or the cooks can make some use of him." Fred heard this with a start of dismay. It was decidedly more than he had bargained for, because now that he had had the information he had come to get, he wanted to get back to the wireless as quickly as possible. It did him no good to know the German plan, or to have a hint of what it was, unless he could pass on his knowledge to those who could make some use of it. But he could not protest when the officer wrote down an explanation of what was to be done with him, telling him that the road to Gumbinnen was not safe, but that he would see to it that Fred should get to a safe place. So when the soldier, Schmidt, had patted his horse's back and indicated that Fred should climb up, Fred had no choice but to obey. He had plenty to think of, too, as they rode along. For one thing, while he had taken his chance and won, since this officer had not seen him before, there was every prospect that he would be recognized if he were taken now to headquarters. He supposed that was where he was going, and he knew that a number of the officers who had left the parsonage with General von Hindenburg on the night of the Cossack raid would be present. It would be strange indeed if none of them knew him, and it took no imagination to guess what recognition would mean. There was just one thing in his favor now. It was beginning to get dark. He did not know how far they had to ride, but he hoped it was a long way. Ordinarily, he would not have wanted the ride to be prolonged because his position was highly uncomfortable. Fred could ride well himself, but riding alone on a horse and sitting behind a man who fills his own saddle with very little to spare are two different things. Try as he would, Fred could not think of a means of getting away. To escape from 5 mounted men by slipping off the horse and running for it was manifestly impossible. He gave up that idea before he even elaborated on it. But soon the glimmering dawn of an idea came to him. The pace slackened, and he noticed that he and Schmidt were falling behind. The lieutenant called out sharply, and Schmidt, growling to himself beneath his breath, used his spur and brought his horse up into the alignment with the others again, but only for 100 yards or so. Then the horse faltered and fell behind again. Now the lieutenant reproved Schmidt sharply. "I'm sorry, Herr Lieutenant," said Schmidt. "My poor beast is very tired, and he is carrying an extra burden. He has had more work to do today than any of the others. If you would permit me to drop behind and come in alone, it is not so far now." "Very well," said the lieutenant. "We'll never get there if we hang back waiting for you." And he gave the word to ride on. Schmidt at once began to take things more easily. Fred heard him grunting to himself. "Those verdammter young officers," he grumbled. "Just because they have a pair of shoulder straps, they think they know it all. I would like to put some of them across my knee." Fred knew enough of German discipline to be vastly amused by this. But he had no time now to think of trifling things. His whole energy was devoted to finding some way to turn this new circumstance to his own advantage. It seemed to him that there ought to be some way of managing it. And in a moment he got the idea. Schmidt was as tired as his horse, or even more so, and by this time he was swaying in his saddle and half asleep, as a trained horseman often does. Fred leaned forward and very quietly cut the saddle girth almost through. He knew that the slightest strain would finish the work. Schmidt was utterly unconscious of what was going on. Fred could tell from the man's breathing just what his condition was. He would snore a little, and then, with a start, he would arouse himself, breathing normally for a minute. Then the snoring would start again. He was trusting himself entirely to his horse. Dusk had fallen now, and Fred decided that it was time to see if his plan was feasible. He took a handkerchief from his pocket, rolled it into a ball, and flung it straight ahead so that it fell unrolling right before the horse's eyes. The effect was inevitable. The frightened horse reared. At the strain the severed girth gave, and the saddle, rolling, spilled both Schmidt and Fred into the road while the horse bolted. Fred lay still, watching Schmidt, who rose, cursing fluently, and stood for a moment staring stupidly after his horse. Then he began to call, and broke into the awkward lumbering run of the cavalryman. Fred might have slipped away then, but he was sure that Schmidt would catch the horse, which must, he thought, be trained to stop even after a momentary panic, and it was not his plan to seize a chance that might, after all, not be as good as it looked. He wanted to make as sure as possible of getting away, and now, as soon as Schmidt had started after the horse, he crawled over to the saddle, which lay where it had fallen. He took the heavy revolver out of the holster and was duly grateful for one thing he had noticed. These Uhlans carried no carbines. The only weapons, seemingly, were their lances and the revolvers in their holsters. He was not a moment too soon. Schmidt came back almost at once, leading his horse. He was scolding it for running, and he was also expressing his opinion of government saddles and leather. He found the broken girth and sat down at once to mend it. Fred scarcely dared to breathe for a moment. But Schmidt did not notice the empty holster, and though he growled and swore when he saw how the girth had snapped, he did not seem to notice that it had been caught almost through. Fred went over and looked at him. Then idly, indifferently, he went to the horse, which was standing perfectly still, though its flanks were heaving. Fred patted the horse's head. Schmidt glanced around at him. His back was turned, and he seemed to see nothing worthy of attention in Fred's attitude. And then, with one spring, Fred was on the horse's back, and bending low, was urging the tired animal back over the road he had traveled so slowly. With a cry of mingled rage and surprise, Schmidt leaped up and began shouting, but the horse, ready enough to obey when it was running riderless away, now obeyed the more convincing orders of its rider. Fred, moreover, was a welcome contrast to Schmidt's big bulk, and there was a difference of at least 70 pounds. Fred turned once to look at Schmidt and saw him staring with an expression of stupefaction at the empty holster. Then he devoted himself entirely to the road ahead. It was as he had thought and hoped. Schmidt did not have another pistol, and with Fred urging him on, the horse galloped on as if it had been really fresh. Thank heaven he's stupid, that Schmidt, thought Fred. Then he had a fit of remorse. He was afraid that it would go hard with Schmidt, for he knew that in the German army excuses are not readily accepted. However, it was not the time to think of the sentiment. Fred was taking desperate chances himself, and it had been a case of seizing any chance of escape that offered itself. Not only his own liberty, but very probably his own life had depended upon his getting away. He knew enough by this time to understand that the outcome of the first campaign of the war might depend upon the accuracy of the information the Russians obtained of the German movements. It was plain to Fred that the Russians, in this quarter at least, had not been served well by their spies. He was surprised at the absence of initiative the Russians had shown in some ways. Aeroplane scouting, for instance, would have made it impossible for the Germans to spring such a surprise as evidently was in preparation. The Germans were using their aerial scouts. It was one of them detecting the approach of General Suvaroff and his Cossack raiders, who had spoiled the plan for the capture of von Hindenburg. But though he had felt that he was perfectly justified in sacrificing Schmidt to his own need to escape, Fred could not help feeling sorry for the poor fellow. I hope he'll be able to think up a good story, he said to himself, and by George, I hope I don't meet any more German soldiers. They would certainly finish me off if they found me riding on a German horse. There isn't anything I could do that would make them think that was all right, no matter how stupid they were. He urged his horse on now, as hard as he dared, tired though he knew it to be. His plan was simple enough. He meant to ride within a mile of a village, and then dismount, letting the horse go wherever it liked. Its usefulness to him would be over as soon as it had put him past the possibility of a pursuit. He thought his troubles were nearly over. But suddenly, around a turn in the road, came a glare of a light, and in his ears sounded the bugle of a German military automobile. End of chapter 14. Recording by Kangaroo.